By the summer of 1984, a battered Curtiss Helldiver sat on dry land near Seattle after nearly 4 decades beneath Lake Washington. Its engine was gone. Much of the tail was missing. The outer portions of the wings were incomplete. The airframe carried the marks of fire training, years underwater, and a recovery that had nearly ended in disaster. 2 young divers had found it, rigged it with lift bags, lost it again, and finally dragged it back toward shore. Then the United States Navy arrived and said the airplane still belonged to the government. That claim created a strange problem. The Navy was not trying to recover an aircraft lost in combat or forced down by accident. It was claiming an aircraft the Navy itself had once stripped, burned for training, and deliberately thrown into the lake. The machine at the center of the dispute was Curtiss SB2C-1A Helldiver BuNo number 75552. It had entered Navy service in 1944 and was first assigned at Alameda, California. By October, it had been transferred north to Naval Air Station Seattle at Sandpoint. This particular Helldiver belonged to an early version that remained in the United States. BuNo 75552 never built a combat record. Its active life was short. On January 31, 1945, the aircraft was involved in a documented ground accident. The surviving records used in later histories do not establish enough detail to reconstruct exactly what happened, and there is no reason to invent one. What matters is the result. The Navy did not return the Helldiver to flying service. It was struck from use and became something far less valuable than an operational aircraft. It became a training object. The damaged Helldiver was used for firefighting practice. Crews could work around an airframe that no longer had to survive the exercise. Parts were removed. The aircraft was burned during training. Useful equipment disappeared. By the time the Navy had finished with it, this was not a complete Warbird waiting to be saved. It was a stripped, damaged shell. Eventually, the Navy disposed of it in the most direct way available. The remains were dumped into Lake Washington. The distinction matters. BuNo 75552 did not crash into the lake. No pilot was fighting to keep it in the air. No crew was trapped inside as it sank. The aircraft had already been written off. It was disposed of rather than preserved. The wreck settled roughly 150 feet beneath the surface. For decades, the lake hid it. Lake Washington was not empty. Military aviation had left other traces there, and stories circulated about aircraft resting on the bottom. By the early 1980s, 2 young divers, Jeff Hummel and Matt McCauley, became interested in finding them. They did not begin with the resources of a Navy salvage command or a museum recovery expedition. They worked with a small boat, diving gear, persistence, and side-scan sonar. The sonar mattered because at 150 feet, searching by simply descending and looking around would be hopelessly inefficient. From the surface, the equipment could scan broad areas of the bottom and reveal shapes worth investigating. Late in 1983 and into 1984, Hummel and Macaulay searched the lake. Their boat was only about 16 feet long, a modest platform for work that demanded repeated passes over deep water. Side-scan sonar did not hand them an identification. It gave them shapes and returns on the bottom. Each promising contact still had to be investigated by a diver before they knew what they had found. The search itself was a process of narrowing uncertainty. From the boat, a sonar return could suggest the outline of something artificial, but it could not tell them whether a shape was the aircraft they wanted, another wreck, or simply something that looked promising on the screen. Confirmation still required someone to leave the surface, descend through the dark water, and inspect the object directly. The equipment reduced the size of the search. It did not remove the need to dive. They located other aircraft contacts during the search. That mattered because it confirmed that the stories about discarded military airplanes in the lake were not simply local folklore. The bottom really did hold aircraft. One target was different enough to justify a closer look. Macaulay descended to investigate. At that depth, daylight was of little help. The water around the wreck was dark, and the aircraft was not waiting in the form anyone would have seen on a carrier deck. The engine was missing. Sections of the tail and wings were gone. The structure had been damaged before entering the water and then left there for almost 40 years, but enough remained to identify it. That identification changed the value of the object in front of them. The wreck was not simply another anonymous aircraft on the lake floor. It had a specific bureau number and a traceable Navy history. The damage visible underwater could now be connected to a known airframe that had served at Sand Point, been written off, used for training, and deliberately discarded. The lake had preserved enough of that history for the two divers to recognize what they had reached. They had found BuNo 75552. Finding it was only the first problem. An aircraft resting 150 feet down is not recovered simply because divers can reach it. The wreck had to be rigged, lifted, controlled, and moved toward water shallow enough for the final stage of the job. Hummel and McCauley chose inflatable lift bags as the core of their recovery system. The idea was simple enough to understand. Divers would attach the bags to the aircraft. Compressed air would inflate them underwater. As the bags filled, their buoyancy would help lift the wreck from the bottom. If the bags held enough air, the Helldiver could rise. If they did not, the support would disappear. That difference would define one of the most dangerous moments of the recovery. The first attempts did not succeed. Later museum accounts described 2 unsuccessful lifts before a third attempt finally moved the Helldiver into shallow water. That detail matters because the successful recovery can otherwise look deceptively simple in photographs. A wreck sitting on a truck tells nothing about the attempts that ended with the same wreck back where it started. Every dive meant returning to an aircraft that could not help them. There were no intact landing wheels to roll it out, no complete wings to stabilize it, and no engine to restore its original balance. The salvagers had to work with the structure that remained, and with a lifting system they could manage from a small surface operation. One of those failures became the event Hummel and McCauley would remember for the rest of their lives. They rigged the wreck and began the lift. The bags filled. For the first time in decades, the Helldiver moved away from the bottom of Lake Washington. That alone was a major achievement. It showed that the system could overcome the basic problem that had held the aircraft there for almost 40 years. The wreck was no longer fixed in the darkness. It was rising. Then the lift began to fail. According to McCauley's later account, unusually cold conditions affected the relief valves in the lift bags. Air began escaping. The amount of buoyancy supporting the aircraft decreased, the motion reversed. The Helldiver that had been climbing through the water started downward again. At the surface, the problem was immediately larger than the wreck itself. A tow line still connected the aircraft to the salvage boat. As the Helldiver sank, that line tightened. The wreck was going down. The boat needed to stay on the surface. The tow line connected them. The stern began to be pulled toward the water. The aircraft was descending. The line was under tension. The boat was taking water. Whatever had been planned for towing the wreck no longer mattered. The immediate problem was separating the boat from the aircraft before the sinking wreck pulled the stern farther under. McCauley cut the line. The boat was swamped. People ended up in the water. McCauley later recalled being pulled under before freeing himself and reaching flotation. Below them, BuNo 75552 disappeared again into the lake. The Helldiver had been raised from the bottom and then lost a second time. The explanation was simple. The aircraft had been supported by air trapped in the lift bags. Once enough air escaped, the system could no longer hold the wreck up. The important question was what Hummel and McCauley did after surviving it. They went back. That decision deserves more attention than any invented speech could give it. Nothing about the previous result suggested the next attempt would be easy. Their boat had been swamped, the aircraft was again underwater, and the basic recovery problem still existed. But the failed lift had also demonstrated something useful. The Helldiver could be moved. The wreck was not permanently fixed to the bottom. The lifting concept had produced enough buoyancy to raise it. The failure had therefore answered one question while creating another. The wreck was not too deeply buried or too immovable to lift. The problem was control. Raising the aircraft was only part of the job. They also had to keep it supported long enough to move it away from the deep water, where another loss would put them back at the beginning. The task now was to do the same thing without losing control of the aircraft on the way up. Another attempt was prepared. Divers returned to the aircraft. The lifting system was rigged again. Air was sent into the bags again, and once more the Helldiver began to rise. This time, the goal was not to make one dramatic jump from the deep bottom of Lake Washington directly to dry land. The real breakthrough was to move the aircraft into water shallow enough that the remaining job became manageable. The third attempt worked. The significance was not that the Helldiver suddenly appeared on the beach. It did not. Recovery came in stages. The aircraft first had to be moved out of the deep water environment that made every problem harder. That staged approach also changed what success looked like. The salvagers did not need the wreck to travel all the way from the bottom to dry land in one uninterrupted lift. They needed to move it far enough that the next part of the operation could be done in shallower, more forgiving conditions. Every foot upward reduced the distance between a difficult underwater salvage and an aircraft that could finally be handled from the surface. BuNo 75552 was brought from roughly 150 feet down into water only about 20 feet deep. That change transformed the recovery. At 150 feet, every inspection required a serious dive, and much of the rigging had to be handled at depth. At 20 feet, the Helldiver was still underwater, but it was now far easier to control, tow, and prepare for the final move toward shore. A tug was brought in to help. Slowly, the remains of the Helldiver were moved toward land. The same airframe that had vanished below Lake Washington as discarded Navy material was now approaching the shoreline in full view. Only then could the scale of the project be seen clearly. The recovery had not produced a complete airplane. There was no engine waiting to be cleaned and restarted. Major sections were gone. The fuselage and remaining center structure were scarred by everything that had happened before and after disposal. But the identity of the airframe had survived. This was the Helldiver the Navy had removed from service in 1945, burned for training, stripped, and thrown into Lake Washington. Hummel and McCauley had brought it back. But bringing the wreck onto land also made it visible to an owner they had not expected to reappear. After the wreck came ashore, naval investigators became involved. The Navy took the position that BuNo 75552 still belonged to the United States government. For Hummel and McCauley, the contradiction was obvious. The aircraft had spent decades underwater because the Navy had deliberately put it there. The two salvagers had done the searching. They had paid for equipment. They had made repeated dives. They had lost one lift, swamped a boat, returned to the wreck, and finally hauled it into shallow water and onto land. Now the organization that had discarded the aircraft wanted possession of it again. The dispute moved into federal court. The central issue was not whether the aircraft had once belonged to the Navy. That was obvious. The question was whether the government had merely lost possession of the Helldiver or had intentionally abandoned it. An aircraft that had gone down accidentally would be one thing. An aircraft removed from service, used as a training hulk, stripped and deliberately dumped, presented a very different history. Records showing that BuNo 75552 had been removed from service and deliberately disposed of became crucial. The same bureaucratic trail that once marked the end of the aircraft's useful life now helped establish what had happened to it. The case continued for roughly 2 years. Hummel and McCauley ultimately prevailed. Later accounts of the case state that the court treated the Helldiver as property the Navy had abandoned, allowing the salvagers to keep what they had recovered. It was an unusual second recovery. First, they had to get the Helldiver away from the bottom of Lake Washington. Then they had to keep it after it reached land. Winning the case did not make the aircraft fly. In some ways, the longest part of the story was only beginning. The wreck that emerged in 1984 was a historical airframe, not an airplane ready for restoration with a few new panels and an overhaul. Too much was missing. Too much had been damaged. Bringing BuNo 75552 back to flight would require a far larger undertaking than simply reversing the effects of freshwater immersion. The Helldiver changed owners over the years. Restoration efforts began, moved, paused, and continued. Different specialists became involved. Missing assemblies had to be sourced or rebuilt. Surviving structure had to be evaluated and repaired. The task was not to preserve the lake wreck exactly as found. The objective became to return the identity and surviving structure of BuNo 75552 to the form of a complete, airworthy Helldiver. The recovered material was only the starting point. Major assemblies were missing, and what survived underwater still had to become part of a complete, functioning aircraft again. The process stretched across decades. That long timeline is important because it prevents the recovery from being turned into a false transformation. The men who raised the wreck in 1984 did not pull a complete Helldiver from the lake and watch it fly a few years later. They recovered the identity and surviving structure of an aircraft that would require years of additional work by many other people. The difference between salvage and restoration is visible in the timeline itself. 1984 marks the moment the airframe returned to land. It does not mark the moment the airplane returned to service. The recovery preserved the possibility of restoration. It did not complete it. That distinction is what makes the later flight meaningful rather than miraculous. Eventually, the project reached Westpac Restorations in Colorado Springs. There, the final stages brought BuNo 75552 closer to the condition it had not seen since 1945. By the summer of 2024, the question was no longer whether the wreck could be recovered. That had been answered 40 years earlier. The question was whether this particular Helldiver could return to the air. On August 8, 2024, it did. With Charles Tuna Hainline at the controls, the restored BuNo 75552 took off from Colorado Springs on its post-restoration flight. For anyone who knew only the aircraft's appearance after the 1984 salvage, the contrast was severe. The burned, incomplete shell that had arrived on land without an engine now had the systems and structure required to leave the ground under its own power. The image completed a sequence that had begun with disposal. The Navy had once decided this airframe was no longer worth repairing. It had used it for firefighting practice. It had stripped it. It had dumped it into Lake Washington. There the aircraft remained for almost 40 years. Then, 2 young divers found it. The lift that should have brought it closer to shore instead sent it falling back into the lake and swamped their boat. They returned and tried again. The third attempt moved the aircraft into shallow water and finally toward land. Then came the ownership fight. Then came decades of restoration. The flight in 2024 was the clearest proof of what the project had become. The following year, on July 19, 2025, the National Museum of World War II Aviation presented the restored aircraft in a public event with Matt McCauley present. The machine he had once reached by diving into the dark water of Lake Washington was now above him in the Colorado sky. McCauley later summed up the moment in a simple line: "I never thought I would see this happen." BuNo 75552 remains a flying museum aircraft in Colorado Springs. Its survival was never the result of a single recovery. The aircraft had to be brought back from the lake, kept through an ownership fight, and then rebuilt over decades before it could return to flight. In 1945, the Navy had looked at that airframe and decided it was worth throwing away. Nearly 80 years later, the same Helldiver was back in the air,